Hi everyone. Thanks so much for coming. This is the fourth event in our series of events from our project Cultures of Digital Hate. This is Dr. Hannah Yellen. Just gonna wave. And I'm Dr. Laura Clancy. So thank you to the Independent Social Research Foundation for funding this event. And they've also enabled us to set up a website for the project, which Hannah is going to pop in the comment box. And you'll see past events, published research and collaborators and resources we've gathered from elsewhere. And also our videos of our last couple of events as well. We'll be hosting videos of this event as well on that website, just to be aware. You'll have heard the announcement, but just to flag that we are going to record this event today.
So this project began when our research was picked up by the Sunday Times. And it had a very misleading and inflammatory headline. And as a result, it was research about Meghan Markle, incidentally. And it was remediated around the world. And that process exposed us to a great deal of digital hate. And that got us thinking about the increasing requirement that we are online. For us as academics, it's a requirement that we are doing this work to get funding and that kind of thing. So it started us thinking about this requirement to have a presence online. And in fact, I've been required to do training in growing my Twitter following as a pathway to academic impact. And obviously we believe in sharing our research beyond the academy. It's a very positive and important thing. But it got us thinking about, if our employers want us to go out and do this visible work, what responsibilities do they have for protecting and supporting us? And at no point in all this incitement to do impactful work online have we heard anyone consider the risks of visibility and how unequally these are distributed, given what we know about the way that racism, transphobia, ableism, and misogyny operate online. So, as part of the survey, as part of the project, we've been undertaking surveys with academics and interviews on their experiences of having an online profile. And the results we found mirror many of our experiences. So a kind of a lack of support when experiencing online backlash. And we found that people's likelihood of experiencing online backlash, online hate, is massively impacted by their identity. So, for example, we found scholars of colour found themselves receiving racist abuse, disabled scholars found themselves receiving ableist abuse, female scholars receiving misogyny, and so forth. So we've set up Cultures of Digital Hate, which educates, engages and consults on the pervasive social problem of digital hate. So it began with a focus on academics, as I've described, but now our goal is to eliminate the ways that the risks of visibility are unequally distributed. I'll hand back over to Laura.
Yeah, so we want to think about, how digital hate functions to keep certain voices out of public debate. So we've been working in collaboration with those working in digital industries and policy, and researchers working in industry, government and academia. And today we're really lucky to have four amazing experts to discuss these issues of visibility and what the cultural and creative industries can do to tackle issues of digital hate. So we have Dr. Verity Trott, who is lecturer in digital media research at Monash University in Australia. Iain Bundred, who's head of public policy for UK and Ireland at YouTube. Dr. Shuaishuai Wang, who's assistant professor of media and communication at Jiaotong-Liverpool University. And Ruth Evans, who's policy head for digital harm at the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport at the UK government. And we just want to flag that we did have Tammy Lasaide Anderson as well, who sadly couldn't be here today, who is a tech policy advocacy and campaign strategist and a PhD candidate at King's College London. So we're sad to miss her contribution. Just before we start, a couple of matters on the rules of engagement today. So there's a comment box, a Q&A box that you can use to raise questions throughout, and we've left a bit of time for discussion at the end. Just to say, disrespectful comments will not be engaged with, and people's right to exist on their own terms is not part of the scope of the debate. We'd be grateful if you could fill in our feedback form. We'll put a link to that at the end. And you can tweet about the event using the hashtag Cultures of Digital Hate. So I'm going to give over to our speakers. So each of our speakers will have 10 minutes on the question, how to tackle the pervasive problem of digital hate, and what does best practice look like for supporting individuals who might be made vulnerable to digital hate. And then they've kind of gone beyond that around their own expertise as well. So we're going to start with Verity, please.
Thanks so much. I'm just going to screen share. There we go. Hopefully you can see that, all right. Perfect. Let me know if you have any issues with the slides and something's not visible. So hi everyone, I'm Verity Trott. I'm a lecturer in digital media research at Monash down in Australia. I'm going to first talk a little bit about my position and what puts me at risk and why I'm invested in this type of topic. So most of my research has initially started looking at digital feminist activist campaigns, so like the Me Too movement, but a bunch of other smaller types of digital networks that were feminist oriented, and also feminist themes in popular culture. And my more recent research looks at white supremacist and male supremacist online groups associated to the manosphere. So groups like pickup artists, some MRA, so men's rights activist groups, and men going their own way. So as you can imagine, that would put me kind of at risk of online harassment campaigns from people who are well known at doing online harassment campaigns, such as like Gamergate and all of that. I initially, I guess, got into this topic because there was not much training around how to go about researching sensitive issues. And then there were, of course, institutional expectations that you would build your profile up on platforms such as Twitter. And very early on, I think it was about 2016, I was at the Oxford Internet Institute for some workshops and a symposium, and their advice for anyone researching feminist stuff was to simply not have an online profile. And for me, I thought that was not really plausible and also not the expectations that we had in Australia. In saying that, some of the research that I did in 2016 on it was a really small local kind of conference that I whipped up a paper and I posted it on academia.edu. And it later turned into a book chapter. And it was on rape culture in the Marvel Netflix series, Jessica Jones. And some really nice user on Reddit shared it on a post about like new television. And this user was like, oh, you should check this out, guys. This is a really cool article. I'm like, oh, thanks, man. But he was actually arguing with another user who didn't like the show, who turned out to be a white supremacist. He made comments later, like accusing someone of being a race traitor and all of that. And this guy really didn't like my paper and thought it was biased against men and kind of flipped the narrative around men being victims. And then he took a screenshot of my academia profile and my Monash profile, like my work profiles, my LinkedIn profiles, and then put it like right beside some random porn picture of like a young girl with blonde hair, presumably meant to be me, right? And posted it on a bunch of like porn sites, and it took kind of a life of its own. But it's nowhere near like large scale public harassment in terms of stuff like I guess the conventional online harassment campaigns and backlash campaigns that Laura and Hannah have suffered, really. But it was more kind of like a private online hate thing that just kind of grew with all these private messages and all these people trying to follow me on different social media accounts. And then I had some comment, it was like a private Facebook message in the other folder that threatened to like send it to my boss. And I was like, okay, that's so weird. I better contact my boss and give them the heads up. So this is where, I guess, this is like 3 years after this started. where I actually reached that point where I was like, I better tell someone at my institution. So it was the first point of contact, I guess, I had with an official avenue in terms of how to deal with this type of issue. So I want to then talk a bit about our current support systems and what exists, which is some of the things I do agree with, but not all the processes are there. So I'm going to talk about what currently is in place and then where we should kind of move and develop from there. So I initially got in contact with my head of school, who connected me with what's called the Safer Communities Unit. And the unit is meant to be really the central point of, and this is what they will say on their website, the inquiry, support, and response to problem behavior, any behavior that is concerning, threatening, inappropriate, or unacceptable. And it's comprised of a range of people, but predominantly former law enforcement officers. And they provide on their resources some definitions and examples of what problem behavior is, along with the processes of dealing with specific types of problem behavior. But there's no mention anywhere of online harassment other than cyberbullying between students. So nothing in terms of what happens with staff or really kind of conventional now online harassment campaigns. But in saying that, the process goes along these types of steps. At least this is the steps that I was guided through when I went through the system. And the first is to simply just make a report and to begin a paper trail. And I do actually think this is a really valuable and important or essential step if you need to draw on evidence at a later time, and not just in case things escalate and become more severe and you need to make like an official police report, but for things like promotion. So you might need evidence to justify why you haven't done as much public engagement or as much as your university wants you to, or whatever grant scheme that you might be applying for that they might expect you to have done at a certain level in your career. You might want to draw on some evidence to support why your record looks a certain way, and to demonstrate that you experienced some level of hardship or challenge that has limited, if you can possibly do it, quantify the time that it's limited you in terms of engaging with online content, as well as media engagement, and if at all, the interruption that is made to your career because you spent several days dealing with that kind of rubbish. The advice is to collect and preserve the evidence, especially given online content can be ephemeral, right? So it's useful to try and record as much detail as possible about the types of messages and things that you receive, including date, time, location, and name of user. Again, this can provide hard evidence and even statistics via a log as to the quantified amount of the disruption that you faced. The one thing I think that's difficult in terms of this expectation that you need to record it is that when people find themselves in these situations, they're not prepared. You know, it's upsetting, it's disruptive. They haven't gone through training to do this, and you don't really know. A lot of people have, and there are some studies that I think have looked at this. People's first reaction is to delete something horrific that they've been sent. But the first reaction actually needs to be screenshot that. So it'd be good, and this is optimistic, if there was training for everyone when they're onboarding into new positions or going to investigate or research sensitive topics, or then do another level of media engagement, to have this like natural OH and S type training to prepare people before they're in these situations. So they know this is the traditional guide. These are the steps that we need to do. Screenshot first before anything else, rather than trying to learn these steps when you're right in the middle of it and you're having a panic attack or you're freaking out and you can't process the steps as clearly. The final recommendation that we're given is to consult a larger team of trusted individuals from both the Safer Communities Unit, but also other mentors that we might have, as well as like the head of school and other trusted colleagues. Ideally together, this team that can help you put together an informed plan in regard to whether, how, like when or where you might respond to the abuse that you're being sent, if at all. And obviously this is super case specific though. It can also depend on your status, how long you've been at your university, how far ahead you are in your career, and whether you have much of a network that does what you do. And a lot of people do find themselves being the only one at their institution looking at particular, feminism or like feminist campaign or criminology angle on like male supremacist groups. There are obviously international networks of researchers, like everyone here really, that you can draw on for support. if need be, but some people do find them quite isolated. And I think this was more apparent during the pandemic when people around the world were in different stages of lockdown and disconnected. So moving forward further, there are some things that I think can help the situation. And one is that institutions need to really value and redefine what impact and engagement mean and what that looks like for a whole variety of different researchers. So we essentially have these KPIs that we need to show real world impact, that we're engaging and communicating and translating our work to a public audience through publishing media articles, providing expert commentary on current events. And engagement is important work, and it is important to have a visible public profile on social media like Twitter. And that can help you in terms of disseminating your research and gaining citations. So other aspects that we don't realize are the roll-on effect of widespread engagement and public engagement. And we know citation counts too are kind of biased in that they direct more to white men rather than women and people of color. So all kinds of feeds in together there. In terms of what our institutions can do to reconsider what counts as impact and public engagement, it needs to be, in my opinion, a case-by-case basis. And we need to have something like the research. When we apply for grants in Australia, we have to write a research relative to opportunity, like success and achievement relative to opportunity. And I think this is one area that this narrative can come into play, and it needs to be taken seriously. I haven't seen any examples so far in any kind of applications that I've personally reviewed, but also anyone that I actually know. I haven't seen them write these things in promotion or grant applications that they've had disruptions because of online abuse that they've received. I'm pretty sure I'm the only person that actually writes, that I know of here, that actually writes a narrative where I say, I've specifically curated my media engagement only with trusted journalists that I have existing relationships with and that I had an interview with and I thought they were okay. I will allow them to quote me as a source for their article. Whereas I know some other male scholars who work in the same area as me who have so many more media publications, including opinion pieces, because they don't feel that same level of threat of abuse that I would receive if I did the same thing. So I try to contextualize the amount that I've done as a specifically curated form of media engagement and contextualize it within the threat. So I think that needs to be kind of taught more, but also understood and normalized more in terms of a range, in terms of how we evaluate the range of media engagements that different people have done. I do think specific media training would really help, especially for early career researchers and PhD students. How do you learn who to trust within the media industry? Who is going to represent your article or your commentary fairly, especially when the title, as you guys kind of suggested before, is an editorial responsibility. So it's taken out of our hands, but it's what people read first. And I think that we've come up with that. So how can we have a better training mechanism or guide that allows and connects researchers with journalists to show more ethical ways of doing that? I do think journalists are driven, obviously, by journalistic ethics. And it really depends, of course, on the outlets and their political agendas in terms of what they're coming to the topic with. But I think we can provide researchers confidence to say no to media engagement opportunities if a journalist is breaching a set of criteria or red flags that have been created previously by the university in what we should expect from them, rather than media engagement at all costs, which seems to be the approach that most unis are taking. I also think academic practices around ethics can be improved. And I get a bit hesitant when we talk about individual practices because I don't want to take the pressure off the responsibility and pressure from institutions and how we deal with this. And I don't want to put that on the researcher, but I do think we can do more in terms of researcher ethics and understanding that ethics isn't just about the subject, but about the researcher's safety. So I have seen some even more senior scholars name specific toxic people in their publications that may be co-authored with RAs and early career researchers. And then because they've named a specific person, it's they've got a Google alert from that, and they start harassing all of the authors. And then the RA, who might have had their contract expired, no longer has institutional support at all, and they're off on their own being abused by someone random. So I do think we need to consider researcher safety when we do ethics applications on certain topics, to consider processes such as not naming particular organizations. And if this is more normalized, I know reviewers in journal articles, at least I've been asked to name specific people and like people behind certain quotes by reviewers. And I've been like, no way, that would put like a target on my back, and that breaches our ethics processes. So if we do normalize that across institutions, it should hopefully be flagged at least at the peer review level of publications. And then I'm going to finish off with just a last provocation on what are the additional risks, because during the pandemic, Zoom kind of freaked me out a bit, mainly because a lot of our teaching resources are now being more permanently published on or certain aspects of our university websites with our faces on, which I think can land more to image-based abuse. People can screenshot or record and take certain things out of context. So I think there are some new risks that we need to consider and have this as a dynamic and evolving type of process in terms of how to deal with different forms of digital hate that we're going to see in the future. And I'll end it there.
So true, and we are proponents, agents of that last problem right now. But Verity, thank you very much for, especially for sharing what must have been really difficult experiences for you. Okay, so Laura, we're going to Iain Bundred, head of policy at YouTube. Thank you very much, Iain, for being with us today.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks so much, Verity, for sharing that experience. It's tough to hear, and I think it's important to share both what you've been through, but also the important tips that I'm sure others will talk through about the academic piece. So I'm Iain Bundred. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm here to talk a little bit from a platform perspective, and I wanted to take you through a little bit about how YouTube looks at this as one of the major sites where abuse can appear. And specifically what we're trying to do to tackle it, so you can understand both the systems we use and also potentially how you can interact with them. We've got a few slides, so I'm just going to share that now. If you give me 1 second. Hang on. This is not. Sorry, the technical person who can't do tech. Apologies. So hopefully you can now see that. Is that right? All good? Great. So at YouTube, we look at the issue of digital hate through a lens that we call our 4 Rs. That's really a set of principles that help us set the rules of the road for online safety and make sure that everything that the YouTube product serves to users is appropriate. Essentially what we do, and I think there's a lot of focus around the first pillar, remove, which is setting community guidelines globally that we enforce at scale to ensure that content that we believe breaks our own terms of service doesn't appear on the platform. However, we have to go further than that, because actually a lot of content may either be borderline and not quite touch the sort of it, but also not necessarily be authoritative and relevant to users. So we use 2 other levers, the raise and reduce functions, to try to make sure that our search and discovery functions are delivering the best information, particularly on controversial subjects. So that second pillar, raise, is all about making sure that authoritative content is served, particularly on sensitive issues or at moments of great sensitivity. I'll come on to an example of that shortly. At the same time, we do see harmful misinformation and abuse, for example, where someone, usually a bad actor, has deliberately learned our community guidelines and found a way to stray just up to the line but stop short of crossing it. In those cases, what we do is we use our reduce function to try and demote that content and make sure that it's not showing up in the recommendations, so you wouldn't see it on your home screen or your up next function for those who use the platform. Part of that is about not recognizing that the YouTube recommendation system is a huge part of how our users engage with content, and therefore, when someone has not broken our rules but perhaps is still not delivering high quality content, we don't want to give them the oxygen of our recommendations. Finally, we set a higher bar still for monetization. Of course, YouTube's an enormous and successful monetizer of content. We have a revenue sharing model, which means that huge numbers of creators globally and here in the UK are creating jobs from the revenue sharing. What we do there is we make sure that content that is going to be monetized has a higher bar still than just our community guidelines. And so we're only rewarding those trusted creators who set a higher bar in relation to things such as online abuse. Why do we have those two different bits? Well, as I mentioned, we believe that raise and reduce, these two search and discovery pieces, are really important in balancing freedom of expression. I think academics on the line will probably agree that just having a solely very very low bar on removals can actually sometimes have a stifling effect on freedom of speech. So therefore, whilst we have a clear and consistently enforced policies around the rules of the road, around our community guidelines, it's really important that we don't act as the arbiter of truth on things that can be controversial and stifle things that are still being open to debate. And that's why we used our search and discovery functions to address the raise and to tweak, as it were, the raise and reduce for content that doesn't break the rules. I'm going to go through each one of those very briefly. On remove, we have a mixture of the community guidelines and, of course, the legal removals. As all global platforms, we will respond to the local laws of the land. And I think in relation to this issue of abuse and particularly hate speech, I think it's worth noting that actually the bar for illegal hate speech in the UK is actually quite high, which is why it's important that our community guidelines perhaps at a lower threshold, because we as a major global platform have to ensure that the sort of content that we've heard about already today from Verity, that sort of content hopefully shouldn't be allowed, and we choose to make a different level of that. What is that? Well, our hate speech piece in particular talks about not allowing content that targets protected groups or incites or glorifies violence. It's also got a second tier, which is around fomenting hatred, like dehumanizing a protected group or calling them inferior. And of course, bear in mind the focus of today, gender is one of those protected groups, so is ethnicity. And so if you think about some of the experiences that both the paper that started this project experienced, but also what we've heard from Verity, that's very much about driving down a certain dehumanizing effect, I would argue, and therefore we have policy in place to address that. What does that mean? Well, of course, a lot of this can be contextual. So we ask human reviewers to carefully evaluate the flag content. A small amount of content on YouTube, particularly content that our automated classifiers can capture easily, such as underage sexual abuse content, is removed automatically. However, the vast majority of videos on YouTube that are removed are only done so when a human reviewer has actually looked at it. Now, they both remove it, but they also may choose to age restrict it. Some of these pieces, for example, can be, example of nudity, for example, might be appropriate for an over 18-year-old, but not for others. When it comes to hate speech and online harassment, I think we take a fairly clear line. But we do have that desire to have freedom of expression, so the reviewers may choose to leave that content live if it doesn't come across the guideline. What does that look like at scale? Well, we've seen in the last we report. You can see the link there. Our transparency report. We talk about the removals we make globally. 4.5 million over the last reporting quarter, April to June 2022. Of that, around 500,000, so just over 11%. Was for harassment or cyberbullying, and around just over 3% of it was for hate speech. So, not by any means the main reason we're removing content on YouTube, but just because of the scale we're talking about there, 550,000 putting those two levels together, 550,000 videos in just a quarter globally, does show you that we do face a lot of controversial content in this area, and something that we have to be really vigilant to, using our systems to tackle it as best we can. The second pillar was raise, and obviously the Meghan Markle example I think is really interesting here. You know, we've seen in the days after the Queen's funeral some pretty unsightly reporting and speculation around it. One particular conspiracy I won't repeat, but involved her and the cause of the Queen's death, which I thought was ridiculous. Obviously, now, as well as removing things that cross that hate speech barrier or the harassment barrier, we also think about how we can make sure that users who go on YouTube and perhaps want to find out about the Queen's death or about Meghan herself will get the most relevant information. And that's why we have different news products that are driving people towards the most relevant authority sources. And for example, that on the day of the Queen's death, we broadcast live the state funeral with the royal family's channel. They've got over 4 million views, I think more now, after the incredible commemorations this last week. But looking at where you are searching for the Duchess of Sussex, for example, you can see it's news content that's being delivered first. Now, some would argue that some news content around this individual in particular is not necessarily fair or accurate, but we are looking at those trusted partners and see there, for example, The Guardian showing up #1 when I searched for this yesterday. And I think it's really important here about that point around, we're not necessarily going to remove everything, but we are going to make sure that the first thing that you find is the most authoritative content we've got available. On reduce, we use a systematic approach. External evaluators use guidelines to provide input, and then our machine learning models ensure that we're constantly learning about the borderline content that needs to be taken. And we've seen a real improvement there, so that over, I think, over a 2-year period when we started introducing this, by 2019, we saw a 70% reduction in the watch time of borderline content. And that shows how important it is to remove that oxygen of recommendation, particularly in this area. And on reward, as I mentioned, we set this higher bar still, and we ensure that any creators who are part of our YouTube partner program and are able to benefit from this, the unique revenue sharing opportunities that YouTube provides, are only done so by complying with our monetization policies and complying with that higher bar of ad-friendly content guidelines. And it's worth saying here, we do that because that's the right thing to do. It's important from a responsibilities platform. We also do it because advertisers don't want to be next to this content. And I think, as academics, you will probably be less likely to be monetizing your feeds that much, although we do have quite a lot of good learning content, and I encourage people to use YouTube. At the same time, where you see examples of negative content and it's being monetized in particular, 9 times out of 10, the advertiser would be horrified to be next to that. And so therefore, reporting it is really important, because actually people don't want to be connected to that. And it's important that if our systems have missed it, that we have quickly get a content reviewer to do so and look at that. And if it's your own personal experience, I really encourage you, whilst I understand the difficulties that Verity was talking about, just to do a simple action of click on the switch and make sure it's done there. Before I wrap up, I just wanted to think about, sort of taking a step back at the macro level, about whether we can work with academics who are passionate in this area, not so much on your personal experience and as you're going through facing online abuse, but perhaps those who are researching online abuse and looking to tackle it. Is there more we can be doing with you? And there's 2 particular programs that YouTube offers that I'd encourage everyone who feels able and willing to do so to participate in. The first is our flagging piece. We have a 24/7 review, and we have something called trusted flaggers for academics and NGOs who perhaps want to report at scale various URLs. So it's not just taking that little button and doing it, but also being part of a global initiative to help us find the most problematic content and make sure that we're reviewing that. The advantage of that process is that you can upload multiple URLs, etc. Very easy to do it. It's not just on the UX is better for academics working on projects. It's also that we make sure that our reviewers are looking at that as a priority, and that you get the feedback about what has happened to those reports. And I think that's important for those who are taking large scale projects. The second is just this last over the summer we've launched a YouTube researcher program, which gives an expanded API to academics and helps you deliver insights that will be relevant for yourselves, but also hopefully useful for us. We provide in-house technical support, and we offer this program to applicants from across academia, as long as they're free from affiliation with Alphabet or Google, so to ensure that they're genuinely independent. That's a big step for us, and it's important, we think, to make sure that we can have the community come together and start to help us, test and learn what's working, but most importantly, call out where things are not working so we can continue to always improve. And with that, I'll pass back to the panel.
Brilliant, thank you, Ian. Really interested to hear all that work in practice as well, actually, rather than just talking about kind of our experiences. Thank you. We're going to go to Shuaishuai now, please.
Thank you, but I didn't prepare slides for this event, so I'm going to briefly share some of my research papers recently. My name is Shuaishuai Wang. I'm an assistant professor of media and communication and the University of Liverpool's China campus in Suzhou, a city close to Shanghai. Today I'm going to discuss how visibility can operate as a form of vulnerability in digital platforms. I'm going to use a case of HIV positive people, who share their predicaments and stories on Zhihu, a question and answer platform similar to Quora, if you have ever used Quora. So why this, Chinese HIV positive people, they go to Zhihu, for sharing their personal stories, their predicaments on a daily basis, the discrimination they face in workplaces, in employment. Because when I look at China's policy on HIV, we do have laws to protect the employment rights of these HIV positive people, and also their privacy. We do have this kind of laws to have been made to protect their rights. But when it comes to the implementation of these laws, we can see some very sharp differences. The lawmakers, they ask employers, the lawmakers make it illegal for employers to request the HIV test for job applicants. But the lawmakers themselves, they are exempted from this law. So they have a different law that requires people who want to enter the public service jobs or the university jobs. They made it mandatory for people to test for HIV. So you can see, so the lawmakers make the law to protect HIV people, their employment rights, their privacy, and they even make it illegal, for any individuals or medical institutions to review the HIV status of a person. But when it comes to the implementation, they are the one, who choose not. They are the one then choose not to honor the law that they have made. So you can see the mixed government message here. That's why, in this context, a lot of HIV positive people, they go to Zhihu, to share their predicaments, their stories about, daily struggles, about their health condition. But, when they ask, what kind of experience they, being discriminated or injustice they face in workplaces, a lot of comments solicited are not that supportive. Actually, people ask, how did you get infected in the first place? So they tend to, attribute this health condition to some, personal risk. It's your personal choice. If you have lived, if you haven't lived a promiscuous sex life, you might be, avoided this kind of health condition. So, when they seek for help on social media platforms, the only response, the majority of response that they received from the internet are hate speech, bigotry, and also abuse of, personal sexual life. And they are also abused for being, having, many sexual partners. This kind of, they do not think this, risks social. They think the risk personal. So it is an individual choice. So if you do not, live a promiscuous life, if you do not have many sexual partners, you might be, live a healthy life. So then it leads me to think, China has the law to protect HIV positive people. And, when we think about institutions, be it, corporate institutions or government institutions, I think, the one who is supposed to protect the vulnerable groups, right? But when it comes to the real situation, you can see a lot of these vulnerabilities are institutionally produced. So because people, even the people who use social media, they think this kind of risk is highly personal. It's not like a social issue. So if you have this personal issue, you should deal with it personally. So you can see even the law doesn't guarantee that kind of protection that it is supposed to protect. So that's why I want to argue that some vulnerabilities are not, we cannot see vulnerabilities as merely personal, as merely cultural, or a personal feeling, or a personal emotional status. But we need to see vulnerabilities, a lot of vulnerabilities, as deeply materialistic, because they are real people face this kind of problems in their daily life. And if we categorize this kind of risks as personal, individual, we might lose the right way to tackle this problem. So so that's why I think we should see these vulnerabilities as the institutional outcomes. So they're not personal, they're not individual, and even for HIV positive, it might be considered as a form of vulnerability. But for normal people, they might become vulnerable, someday in their life course. Maybe some unforeseen circumstances such as natural disaster or aging. This kind of people, one way or another in their life course can become vulnerable. So that's why I think, for institutions, when they tackle the vulnerabilities, they need to think, not to protect certain groups, but to address certain vulnerable condition, this precarious condition that they need to focus on. Not to, we need to protect, gender minority or sexual minority. I don't think it's a good approach to address this problem. We need to, make that exact vulnerable condition as the object of protection. So that in this way, we might, come up with some policy or a regulation or lawmaking, to protect this vulnerable, different kinds of vulnerable conditions. So two main takeaway points, based on my research. The first one is a lot of vulnerabilities are institutionally produced. They are not personal, and we should, stop seeing, vulnerabilities as a personal feeling, personal emotional status. And the second, vulnerabilities are deeply materialistic. So it relates to a lot of things, in employment rights and privacy, all these kind of things. That's all my sharing for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Shuaishuai. Brilliant. It's really nice to get this kind of different global perspective as well on how this works. I think that's important because, of course, we're not working in national boundaries, are we, when we're working online. Okay, so next up we have Ruth, and I said Evans before, but I'm really sorry, it's Ruth Y. So thank you, Ruth. Sorry about that.
Hi, everyone. Pleasure to be here. I should also just correct my job title as well, because I'm not actually head of digital harm. I'm not sure there is a head of digital harm at DCMS, but I head up the advertising policy team at DCMS, which is part of the Media and Creative Industries Directorate. And we concentrate on all sorts of things to do with advertising, including things like how it's regulated in the online space. So I don't come here with direct kind of, I guess, experience or particularly policy sort of exposure, I guess, to online hate. But it does come up a little bit when thinking about advertising. I also have a sort of background in sort of media regulation, having worked on things like content policy and press policy in the past. So I suppose in my career, I've come up against some of these issues So hopefully I have something that I can sort of impart here, although I would say that I'm not really speaking on behalf of the government or kind of talking government policy here, because particularly at the moment, as you will have noticed, we have a new government, and some of the things that we're doing, including, for instance, on areas like online safety, are sort of being reconsidered by the new ministers that are in place. So I wouldn't want to sort of talk too much in that space at the moment, whilst they have an opportunity to look at some of those things. First of all, just to kind of talk a bit about sort of my domain, thinking about advertising. And one of the key roles that we have thinking about public policy around advertising, particularly online, is about protecting people, and how can you protect people, and what kind of levers do you have available. And hate speech does occasionally come up in advertising. I can think of a good recent example of an MP, Lee Anderson MP, who was sort of accused of being a paedophile through advertising. People bought adverts that said that. So, and he was able to take that to. He was successful in suing Google, I believe, for that. So it can happen, and that was a case of defamation. But it's not as common. I think what comes up is more that advertising sometimes can be funding digital hate, and that's kind of an interesting relationship between advertising and hate speech that might be occurring in the content that the advertising is sort of I guess enabling, if you like. So that's a kind of interesting kind of dynamic. I mean, I thought that there were kind of two things, and it's interesting listening to the last couple of speakers. It struck me that there are two things that you're grappling with here. First off, as sort of academics and wanting to be able to properly engage in public discourse safely, your kind of and your piece of work, and I can see that there are other bits of work going on. I was quite interested in what Alan Turing Institute are doing in this space, in creating a kind of set of things that they can you can, like a toolkit, if you like, for people trying to be involved in discourse, kind of help people in the moment, if you like. So kind of prepare themselves as you enter public discourse. So there's something there about what can you do in the moment, and how can you prepare yourselves in the moment, and what kind of toolkits, education, training, etc. can you use. But also it strikes me that there is a bigger picture kind of issue that you'll be wanting to try and kind of shift, and that is much more about sort of what's the wider environment and how do you improve the wider environment. So obviously you want to protect yourself in the moment, but that doesn't seem like that's good enough, really. It feels like that needs to contribute to that bigger picture. How do we actually shift the wider environment? And sort of stepping back, it struck me that there are four sort of areas where you might think about how to achieve that. The first is very much kind of that kind of education and training piece. How can you go into kind of public discourse in a safe way and in an informed way? There's then a kind of piece around industry action and policies. And we sort of heard from YouTube today, but sort of all the big platforms that are sort of enabling, I guess, this public discourse to happen, and to some extent the news organisations as well, sort of have policies that should be helping police some of these things. And I think there's something interesting there about sort of what those policies look like, how well they're upheld, etc. And there's public advocacy, and I think there's something there about sort of how you can influence and change the wider public debate in this space, and sort of coming back to kind of thinking about how you protect yourselves in the first place. I wonder if there's something about collective action across academia that can really kind of start to make an impact on things like the industry policies that are there, and sort of shifting the dial on what the, you know, where the bar is on some of those things. So moving from that kind of, actually we just need to protect ourselves, we need some training, we need some toolkits for ourselves, but how can you kind of transform that into a bigger kind of public advocacy, that kind of piece of collective action. And I'll come back to that in a minute, because I just had some thoughts on how you might go about that. And then the fourth area is obviously the law, and that is the common law at the moment, things like defamation, which I think when it's just kind of small, these things are happening in a very kind of small way online, rather than big cases where, and like things like defamation, you sort of, the effort that goes into trying to bring some of those cases is enormous. It's available to people with big pockets, and sort of, you know, there's a lot of sort of, I don't know, you know, the risk that you put yourself in even going near that, even if it was available to you, is huge. So it obviously isn't an answer on its own. But then there's regulation, and you know, the online safety bill is making its way through Parliament at the moment, and that does offer you know, potentially something in this area. But of course, we come back to the kind of balance between kind of these sorts of kind of situations arising, and what I would consider to be kind of, a form of censorship or even blackmail, kind of using people's identities to shut them up basically. But freedom of expression sort of is a really important, is something that's really important to protect. And I know that when those lawmakers are thinking about the balance of regulation, they're trying to weigh those things up, and freedom of expression remains really important. And it's very tricky, I think, to regulate in these sorts of spaces without unintended consequences. So just coming back to that point about how you can kind of translate, I guess, kind of that just, we just need to protect ourselves in the moment, and how you can translate that actually more into a kind of way of influencing the public discourse more generally, and maybe making a bigger change. I think sort of raising the profile of best practice seems really important. And I know you've spoken about sort of, I'd be interested to hear back, because I'm sure there's things going on in this space, I just might not be aware of it. But sort of how you are kind of creating those toolkits, it strikes me that sort of understanding which kind of media outlets or online platforms might be the best, sort of have the best policies, are likely to protect you the best. Understanding what those policies are, how they work, how well they're upheld, I think is really important, and some transparency about, because there's one thing to sort of write those policies down, but actually how well are they being policed and enforced is quite important. And I don't know to what extent there has been some research and analysis around looking across all of those policies, how they might be different across different organisations. I know some organisations really pride themselves on having excellent policies in these areas. That's their USP. Others kind of are much more free-for-all, and in some respects that's their USP. And it's interesting to sort of, it depends sort of a little bit, I think, sometimes on what that organisation is trying to achieve, but many of them, organisations like YouTube, are really trying to be best practice. And I think sort of a little bit of a kind of, I guess, kind of getting under the surface of that a little bit and understanding that, I think would be an interesting way to move. And I don't know whether there is a kind of collective movement within academia, and my sense would be that the more of you can pressurize for sort of changes to things like like policies and maybe even kind of regulation would be more powerful than singular action. I'm sure you're thinking about that, but it struck me that those were things that might be helpful. So yes, how do you translate that kind of feeling of needing to just protect yourself into a wider sense of actually how do we influence the wider environment? Because probably the latter will create the bigger change. And I can see Iain wants to jump in. I would just say again that these are just my own personal thoughts and not really a kind of reflection of government, because this is not my policy area particularly, although as I did say at the beginning, advertising policy sort of, some of these things kind of come up a little bit in advertising policy. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. Iain, did you want to
yeah, I was going to sort of plus one, as we say in sort of tech companies, to what we were saying there around the kind of almost the way that academics can put pressure on platforms to improve. I think that's really powerful, actually, and I think we're going to be a much more regulated sector in the next few years. And here in the UK, the online safety bill is finally winding its way through Parliament. We'll get there soon. And I think there's lots of other changes coming along, and I'm sure, Ruth, you'll be working on things like the online advertising program as well, which I think will, in time as well, set new regulations for platforms, for advertisers and others. And so I think that's all positive. I also just thought that the call to action there for academics I think is really interesting. I was at a roundtable recently where one person made I thought rather optimistic, but I think potentially powerful case that actually you can, with these new regulations coming in place, you can see a scenario where platforms are trying to outdo each other on being the most safe place to host content. And I think, for normal, there's no normal user, but for many everyday users, that won't be the case. But I think for academics, that very much can be. I think if you come together and start saying, well, you know what, we're just not going to use this platform because it's not safe for us, and start to start to lobby together to the platform saying, like, you need to make changes if you want to have this discourse going on. Because I'm sure, I talked about our YouTube academic program. To be part of it, you want to be using YouTube, right? So we certainly don't want to be losing a core part of free expression and huge partners to us because our platform, our policies are in the wrong place or not being enforced in the right way. So I think there is a real opportunity there to come together, which I'd really be excited about. I also just wanted to address, there's a question in the Q&A about the moderators. This does have a massive impact on moderators. It is a difficult thing. And actually, we saw, for example, during COVID lockdowns, where people had to rush from home and suddenly you were reviewing a lot of negative content, often, perhaps from your bedroom and other places. This is very difficult. And we, as a company, and I think all major platforms have thought very carefully about that. We have rules in place. We actually increased the amount of automation we did during the lockdown period. So we're relying more on human moderators. What that meant, less on human moderators and giving them more breaks in the day and things like this. What that meant was we made more mistakes, because the more you rely on automatic filters, the more errors happen, particularly on a platform like ours where so much is contextual. It's not just an image, it's not just a piece of text, it's how the image and text interrelate. And so we did see a doubling in appeals during the COVID period when we increased the amount of automation. And that's the trade-off, and that's why we try and rely on human moderators as much as possible. But that's also, going back to Ruth's point, that's also one of the ways that YouTube really invests as a company and tries to differentiate ourselves. And we absolutely hope to be leaders in the industry. But of course, we can always do better. And that's something that, the more pressure that comes across the sector, I think, the more that will improve for all.
Thank you. And thank you, Ruth, for your section. I think that idea of kind of coming together to put pressure on, I think, is really important, and thinking about kind of how groups can inform policy as well. The more experiences you have, of course, the more evidence there is and all of that as well. So I think that's a really important point. Before we go to questions from the Q&A, I wanted to give an opportunity for panelists to ask questions of each other if you wanted to. I think, Verity, you might have something you wanted to ask.
Yeah, I've got a question, a bit for Ruth and Iain. So I also, at Monash, I'm part of a research team that looks at targeted ads on social media, primarily Facebook, Google search, and also now on YouTube. I'm primarily involved in the Facebook projects. And whenever we do public events, media engagements, or we're coming out with a publication, we have to be extremely careful with how we frame our research and the way that we receive data. So we don't say that we collect or scrape data from platforms, but we receive data through donations from our participants. And this is all to try and navigate the relationships with platforms such as Facebook that are very hostile to researchers interrogating some of their practices. And we continually, ahead of any kind of publication, have to have check-ins with each other to say, you know, is it okay if this perhaps gets on the radar for Facebook and all your Facebook accounts are deleted? Like, are you okay for that happening? Or are you doing research projects right now that are unrelated that would suffer if your profile is suddenly deleted? And so I'm kind of interested in terms of understanding how Iain sees the relationships. I know you're from YouTube, which we do have more positive relationships with. We've never had threats from YouTube to delete our accounts or anything. But also, you don't even need an account to look at the content. But I'm just interested to know from the platform perspective how you see the relationship with the researchers interrogating, you know, like algorithmic patterns and practices, but also in terms of what Ruth was talking about, the kind of policy and regulation and advocacy aspects that are involved that could perhaps protect researcher rights and that kind of vulnerability that researchers are at, all in terms of allowing the power to be in the platform.
Shall I go first, perhaps then? I think the first thing I always think of these things is it's really important. Often these can feel quite adversarial, and it's really important to be empathetic as to what's driving the concern on the other side. So to give you that perspective first and foremost, it's great that you hear that YouTube aren't sort of sending you legal letters and stuff. That's nice to hear. But you know, I've definitely heard on my side, you know, sort of talking to colleagues in product and stuff, the concerns about opening up too much to academics. You know, of course, YouTube is open. You can do tests on YouTube anytime you want, but things like the API and greater access to our algorithms, you know, there's a real concern about it being gained by bad actors. We see, you know, I mentioned that whole reduce function that we offer in terms of our 4 R's of how to handle harmful content. Oh, it was frozen. Can people hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, great. Apologies. So yeah, so the reduce function is partly because we've seen people learn our community guidelines and work out exactly how to stay within them. So we had to go further to make sure that people who were essentially, you know, gaming the system but weren't actually breaking our terms of service, how can we address that? So the more you open that people to understand the way the systems work and the way we draw the line, the more risk is that the bad actors gain that. Now, that's not to say that we don't trust yourself, Verity, or other academics in that space, but it's how wide do you go with that circle of trust? And that's why, for example, you know, we've had, you know, there's a lot of very legitimate NGOs I work with closely who would like to be part of that researcher program I talked about earlier. But we've said, well, you have to team up with academics to do it, because we've drawn the line around specific academics from, you know, from rated institutions and that kind of stuff. And maybe over time we might expand it, but there will always be a nervousness around it about how people will get to understand it. And, you know, there is also IP concerns, of course. You know, we've spent, you know, billions building these major things, but I do think some of it is actually about the gamification side. And then I think, you know, going forward as well, there's also a lot of, you know, compliance concerns around privacy, and, you know, some of the points that, you know, Meta might be talking about there will actually be about, you know, in terms of scraping data. That's a massive concern as we go forward. And, you know, I know from the Google side, we hugely need to be thinking a lot about privacy and the next generation of how privacy works. So these are all concerns that platforms are trying to deal with. So often you'll be caught up in that rather than any specific concern about the project you're working on.
Yeah, I mean, certainly we've been looking a little bit at kind of some of these issues, and one of the things that we've come up again and again is this kind of availability, I suppose, of data to potentially to regulators, but also maybe in the public domain, so that sort of you guys as academics can kind of provide a kind of level of scrutiny just by looking. You know, I think privacy is something that comes up a lot, and the kind of data protection regime that's actually being reformed at the moment in the UK, and potentially sort of actually some of the requirements around data protection that have actually been made it quite difficult for organisations to share data is being looked at, because I think there's a sense that it's gone a little bit too far the other way and could be rebalanced. But I mean, certainly from a kind of thinking about it from a kind of government perspective, one of the key things we've been thinking about is transparency, and how do you improve transparency in the advertising ecosystem, specifically for where I'm looking. And yeah, there's things like sort of public reporting, kind of data sharing, etc., the types of things that we're thinking about. But they do, you know, as Iain says, it can be quite complex, and you have to balance sort of. Another area that we worry about a lot is sort of how bad actors can access some of these systems. In advertising, the big issue is fraud. It's huge, and you sort of have to balance some of these things. I think it's fair to say, in thinking about the policy. But really, I think the change happens when people really know what's going on, and I think that is to some extent in our research on online advertising. It is quite difficult to know how an advert got from as the advertiser creates an advert and says, please can you serve it to these sorts of audience members, how is it the process by which it gets from that advertiser with that prescription of where does it need to go through to who sees it, as not even knowing who has seen it, is rather untransparent, I think, for many people. And certainly in a sort of big picture way, that's something that we've been focusing on a little bit within government, and thinking how can you safely increase that transparency.
Thank you both. And Laura's having some technical difficulties now as well. So I'm going to go to the Q&A now. But of course, at any point, if any of the speakers have more questions or responses for each other, I'm very keen to hear of those. But I'm going to go to Elizabeth Poole's comment of questioning how can the wider environment be improved when sensationalist content is rewarded through monetization. And that's something that's come up repeatedly through our events, is the culture of polarization. And that's definitely was a factor in our experiences, and it's not unique to any individual platform. It's not unique to online. The headline that was in respected newspaper, you know, we're talking about trusted source, but trusted sources can be implicated too. Sunday Times headline for our article was academics accused Meghan of dropping feminism like a hot potato. And I always need to kind of use the opportunity to say, obviously we didn't say that, not least it wouldn't get through peer review. We also don't believe it. But yeah, so this question of sensationalism and reward and polarization is so fundamental to the way our online spaces work, that even trusted sources are engaged in those terms as well. So, well, when that's the kind of key driving dynamic, how can we tackle that to improve the wider environment? There's a question to
our perspective, if that's helpful. I'm conscious I keep responding. I don't want to monopolise time, but I mean, one thing I think is interesting is it's always important to remember that we're on a bit of a journey. You know, platforms are still quite new, quite young. I mean, we've finally seen a Premier League footballer who's been born since Facebook was started, but it's still quite recent. I think that what we've seen in YouTube, for example, we've seen an iteration in the way that our recommendation systems work, and that's been carefully drawn from both what works for users and also just from learning sort of unintended outcomes. So we started with the only data we had available, which is clicks and views, and what that led to, there was quite a lot of clickbait. Right, and people were just giving you a tantalizing headline. People clicked on it and were disappointed by it. You know, over time, we then exposed that to watch time, and we were rewarding and uplifting content that got lots of watch time. But what we saw over time were people were starting to watch junk food television. You know, they were basically watching the kind of equivalent of like you spend all night gorging on it and then you regret it the next morning, and it might not actually come back to the platform. We also saw, so-called rabbit holes and some changes around harmful content. That's less than 1% of what real content. I think the shift from us towards satisfied watch time was really about giving users not just what they want in the moment, but actually a satisfied experience. And that's why now we see, for example, the more sensational stuff doesn't necessarily perform very well. we've iterated our things again, and we've got a fourth generation of what we call responsibility metrics now, in terms of how the recommendation systems work, and those are often about trying to get users information that's relevant to them, authoritative to them. What is authoritative? I totally hear you, Hannah, on that point, and it's worth saying, if you're interested in that point, that the online safety bill will ensure that we won't be allowed to remove content that we think is harmful if it comes from certain news publishers. So, things that break our community guidelines will have to keep up until we've exhausted an appeals process in the current draft of the online safety bill. So that's an amendment that's coming in the online safety bill. That puts challenges for the authoritative stuff. But I think in general, we've seen users do want that authoritative content, particularly around sensitive news events and moments in time and I don't think, whilst there are certainly, you'll find from your own experience that you might still sort of gorge on certain channels and creators on YouTube. I've not seen that kind of business case that's often talked about in terms of wanting the more extreme or sensational stuff. Partly because we're a revenue sharing platform. We build businesses for creators by serving advertisers, on their content, right? Advertisers don't want to be next to that content. It's bad for business to have content that is controversial and is causing negative headlines, or even just serving against someone that doesn't want to do it. So I've often found that where we are now versus where historically I think the online spaces have been is very different. I know it is different sometimes in other platforms, but for us, we've definitely been on a journey, and I think as regulation comes as well, and Ofcom holds companies like ourselves and the whole sector to account and starts to drive up standards, I think you'll hopefully see that improve in the public space as well. That doesn't mean that the experiences that something that you guys have been through or the Verity's been through, whilst we get from where it was to where it should be, is anyway defensible. It just means that I think we need to recognise that we're all on that trajectory, and we have to work all collectively to try and get that trajectory to speed up.
And does anyone else want to respond to this point about polarisation or sensationalism before I move on to Elizabeth's next comment or question? Okay, so Elizabeth makes the point that policies are not enforced equally within platforms. I suppose I'm going to put words in Elizabeth's mouth there as well, but also we need to talk about between platforms and across geopolitical boundaries. So this is a conversation where we can't just talk about YouTube's policies, because if YouTube completely tightens up everything, then the white supremacists or the incels will just find another platform and another space to build community. So something that we're also coming up against again and again throughout these kind of consultation events is this problem of diffuseness that we're never able to grasp and solve. We're looking for solutions, but any solution that's boundaried, when the internet is so unboundaried, it's just so incredibly difficult. So can anybody, would anyone like to respond to this issue? Ruth?
Yeah, I think you just make a really important point actually about that kind of diffuseness, and that if you drive some of this hate speech into corners of the internet where actually they're not really being kind of challenged about what's being said, there is a kind of environment, a very, very kind of harmful environment that gets created there, and actually that's where things like kind of you find there's slightly less you kind of end up in a kind of part of the internet that is, advertising can exist there. It tends to be for the types of services that you or I are probably not looking for. It's a whole different ball game. You might, it's sort of what you find in some of those areas is that one type of illegality is funding another. So you sort of have IP infringing websites that will have advertising on them from sort of adult services or something like, and I'm sure that some of that hate speech gets driven into some of these corners, these sort of unpalatable corners of the internet. No one's really even watching. There's no challenge from you or I, or sort of, you know, people who are kind of passing through a really big platform. And there's going to be a bit more of a kind of, maybe a bit more of a, you know, a bit of a broader view, if you like. And I know you get the same things with kind of algorithmic kind of wormholes and so on and so forth. And it is very difficult to see. It is a very, very tricky policy conundrum to try and solve, I think. Yeah, so I think thinking about not just, I think the online safety bill will do lots to deal with the bigger players, but I think we're aware and have our eyes open to the fact that it may create pockets elsewhere, and you might have to have different ways to deal with them, maybe. So yeah, it's a very, very difficult to solve, really, and no silver bullet, I suspect.
And just to add to that, I think, you know, I was speaking a lot with a good person on this. If you don't already follow them, is Hope Not Hate. Very focused on extremist content. I work closely with them, and Joe Mullahall and I've talked a number of times about, you know, what's the right answer here? Do you want to, if we push this content off YouTube, do we drive people into small pockets of, you know, extremists? And I think the reality is there's no right answer, as Ruth says, but we've got to take a decision of how globally what are we willing to allow on our platform, right? What are we willing to, the rules of the road we set? I would like to just clarify, they are global rules. Our community guidelines are set globally and enforced globally. The legal removals point, so we may geo-block in certain geographies what we've done. But for example, right now, the content you see in Russia is exactly the content you'll see elsewhere, because we are still on in Russia, even though we've demonetized there. And we are ensuring that you cannot upload their stuff that we wouldn't allow elsewhere. And so we enforce that everywhere. It does mean that, you know, at scale, users go, you know, we've got 3 billion users now on a monthly basis. They're not being exposed to this stuff, but perhaps you do drive people into, you know, quicker into rabbit holes at these like dark corners of the internet of doing it. That is negative. That is obviously a bad situation to have. But I think that, as Ruth says, that requires different policy interventions and more specific use, which I think I know the UK government is working hard on, and other academics have researched deeply as well.
Okay, does anyone else want to respond to those points before I move on to Angela's question to Verity? Okay, so Angela Ashcroft asks Verity, if you are one of the few that is open about how promoting your work might be restricted because of others' actions, do you ever worry about how or whether funding bodies or institutions accept your proposals?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm in the middle of developing a really large fellowship application, which would be funding for 2024. And it's like a 6-month application process. In Australia, it gets really out of control what's expected for grants. And the funding is really based on the identity of the researcher and the narrative that they tell. It's like 40% to do with the project, but it's more about if the project aligns with you and your career. And you have to really sell your narrative, your expertise, and media engagement and public talks have a huge play to role there. I try to use this, and I'm currently, so I can't say that they receive it well, but I'm optimistic in how, because I'm consciously thinking about this, how I can strategically write it into my narrative and make it slightly different to perhaps, there's like another guy that works in my field, and I know he does a lot of opinion pieces for like The Guardian, and I just would not have the support or the, I mean, he does get hate for some of the stuff that he writes, but it's different type of hate than what I would get for what he writes. He would get challenged with some of the ideas because he's a bit more conservative, but I would actually probably get a lot of sexist harassment for that content. So I'm trying to frame it around having expertise of knowing where I can deliver my content and showing that I have evidenced trusted relationships with certain media people who I regularly go to do commentary, or who come to me when they want expert views or perspectives on a current event like the latest shooting or whatever related to manosphere or incels. So I think you can turn it around as a form of expertise because you know the field. You've got, the next level of ethics in terms of your practices. You know how to protect yourself, and just being aware of it, I think, will help building that into the narrative and the story of what's being done. So I am optimistic that they'll understand. Of course, I don't know, I might get a reviewer back that will say something like, you haven't done enough media publications on XYZ or something, or you're not as big as this other person. So I'm sure that might happen at some stage. But I think even doing events like this build awareness of the issue, and hopefully the peers around who are always, we have to remember that we're the ones peer reviewing. It's not some random person that's disconnected to the academic world. So we're the ones making these judgments in terms of what's seen as visible and what's an appropriate amount. I hope that we can normalize and understand and get people to reflect that media opportunities are not open to everyone equally, and it's not safe for everyone. So yeah, it's definitely a concern and a worry, and it takes a lot of my energy, but it will inform the narrative that I write. Also, I just wanted to say that generally I've had positive experiences in terms of the harassment that I got. I got positive experiences with mainstream media platforms and also porn sites. They were very quick to take down content. Where the content stays and sticks around, it's on the anonymous image board websites, which are designed to really be more malicious and part of the alt tech framework, I guess, that we're seeing, that new alt tech platform ecosystem like BitChute. So YouTube's evil shadow, and that becomes much, much harder to regulate and sets a whole other, I guess, questions and issues in terms of how to ban them when VPNs, I mean, some of them are banned, like 8chan or 8kun is banned in Australia, but you can just use a VPN to get around that. So it is a set of tricky questions. But in general, I do think mainstream platforms have been definitely improving. And also, just aside, some of the manosphere actors that I've looked at, they disappear once they're demonetized because they're really there for financial purposes. But the more extreme, ideologically driven actors will turn to platforms like BitChute and just become even more toxic and say, hey, big tech like YouTube are persecuting us. We need to retaliate. So yeah, a whole other set of questions when we see this alternative technological framework emerging.
I think the other thing, Verity, I think came up in your presentation, and it certainly echoed in kind of our surveys and the interviews we've done. And adds kind of, a lot of people have talked about how complicated this is. And I think what people have said is actually the role of, I'm going to call it traditional media, although I hate that term. But so, for instance, newspapers, like particularly tabloids in the UK, are well known for this, and kind of not necessarily digital media platforms who are kind of involved in this process. So, for instance, they'll have, for us, they were the ones who published the headline, which then circulated on social media. But also, they might be the ones who kind of misrepresent research, or they might post it on their social media, and that's what started it. So I think the role of kind of those institutions as well within that process of, not just being kind of anonymous trolls, right? This is kind of an institutional issue as well. And then how that might add another level of complication to all of that as well, in terms of, well, how do you bring those people into the conversation then about how, what not to do in order to start this? And then it becomes, I think, even more complicated than kind of the things we've spoken about.
You just get wider and wider and wider, the net of variables that need to be considered at once. There's just before, we've only got time for maybe a couple more comments. So if anyone's got any last questions, do drop them into the Q&A. I just wanted to make a connection between Shuaishuai's work on vulnerability and what Verity was saying and our research. And that is, and also something that's come up in previous events. We had the pleasure of the charity Glitch joining us, and they do a lot of that kind of advocacy and training work that has been spoken about today. And something that they said that chimed with what we've been writing on at the moment is the first thing that they have to do when they're educating, when they're training and advocating, is persuade people that digital hate is real. And something that we're finding is that our employers don't actually consider the labour that we perform online as real labour. And so they're not going to take seriously an issue of work-based safety, what we consider to be an issue of work-based safety, if they don't consider that to be part of our remit as work. So there's something here about, as Shuaishuai was saying, vulnerability is material. It's not a mere emotion, it's not a feeling, it's not located with the individual, it's material conditions. And I think, you know, Verity, you were pointing out a lot of the rewards for acting online. They're real. It's promotion. They're material. It's financial, and we're still talking about the space as if it is online is virtual, whereas actually using Shuaishuai's terminology of making this material is really useful, not just in making visible the harms that are real and exist offline, even when they originate online, but also the risks and the rewards. These are all material and structural conditions. There you go. There's me just wanging to connect it at the end. But if no one else has anything burning that they would like to add, then I'll just heartily thank all of our speakers. This is an ongoing project, so we will be synthesizing all the content from all of these events. We've got more research forthcoming, and we hope to collaborate with you more in the future, especially Iain and all the ways that you encourage. And actually, Ruth, we've just submitted evidence to the recent call on misinformation, so I don't know if that might even pass through your department, but because academics, we should be amongst those trusted sources in public discourse. We come to share our research that has been through rigorous peer review, and if we're being chased away because of the conditions of being there, that's one less trusted contribution to those debates. So thank you to all our attendees for coming and for your questions, and I'll just awkwardly wave goodbye and end the Zoom call now.
Thank you.